All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our press event today, where we're going to be announcing a brand new report that the ACLU of Maryland is releasing today. It's called Chasing Justice, Addressing Police Violence and Corruption. It's going to be direct links to both the press release and to the report are going to be put into the chat now. And we're going to be hearing today from Kaylin Young, who is the Public Policy Director for the ACLU of Maryland, and Joe Spielberger, who is Public Policy Counsel for the ACLU and also the author of Chasing Justice. Again, my apologies, we're not able to allow you to record, but we will happily give a copy of this recording to anyone immediately afterwards. And we are live streaming on Facebook and Twitter right now. And at the end, we'll take questions in the chat. Kaylin, would you like to start us off?
Yes, thank you, Meredith. Thank you for you and your team for putting this together, always doing a great job, and we're grateful for that. And I want to thank everybody who has taken the time to join us today as we release this report. As you know, this is a very important year here in the state of Maryland with regard to police reform. We have a history here in Baltimore City and also throughout the state of police misconduct that the ACLU has taken the charge of trying to dig in deeply, look at the data, and figure out the best practices and best ways where we can assist the legislature in moving forward, not just with rhetoric, but with reports and with things that they can look at, measurable data and things that can undergird the arguments that are going to be made throughout this legislative session. I want to just really quickly say I'm really proud of Joe for this work that he's done, and I'm looking forward to the positive change that's going to come as a consequence of it. Joe's going to talk about, he's going to give us a little introduction, talk about the purpose and the methodology of the work that he's done. And then we're going to finalize with some recommendations that we think is going to be necessary right now, this year, and in this legislative session. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Public Policy Counsel, Joe Spielberger.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your interest in this report entitled Chasing Justice, Addressing Police Violence and Corruption in Maryland. Again, I'm Joe Spielberger, the Public Policy Counsel for the ACLU of Maryland and the author of Chasing Justice. The purpose of this report is to examine race disparities in different aspects of policing, how police departments contribute to violence in the community and further distrust of both the legal justice system and the internal disciplinary process, and consequences of failing to hold officers and departments accountable. While policing is an issue statewide and the report includes research from local jurisdictions across Maryland, a significant part of the report is independent analysis of data provided by the Baltimore Police Department. In the wake of Freddie Gray's murder and the Justice Department's investigation, BPD partnered with the organization Code for America as part of their Project Comport. Comport is a tool that makes it easier for law enforcement agencies to share internal affairs data and contextual information in order to be more transparent and accountable to the people they serve. So under the partnership, BPD provided 5 years worth of data about misconduct complaints, use of force incidents, and officer-involved shootings from the beginning of 2015 through the end of 2019. This includes more than 13,000 complaints filed against more than 1,800 individual officers. It includes more than 22,000 use of force incidents, and it includes almost 50 officer-involved shootings. Last year, this data was made public. Some of the key findings from my analysis of the data include 6% of BPD officers received approximately 1/3 of all complaints. Only 8% of external complaints, including resident complaints, were sustained. That means that the department cleared officers of misconduct in 92% of all complaints. Complaints by white residents were sustained at higher rates. Complaints against Black officers were sustained at higher rates. Approximately 91% of officers' use of force was directed toward Black residents. Officers remained on the force after sustained complaints of domestic violence, criminal sexual offenses, DUI, DWI, hit and run, and theft. And more than 400 individual officers should have triggered intervention under BPD's current early warning system. So this data analysis provides a clearer picture of how individual officers act in the community, for instance, how they use force in response to certain situations, and also how current BPD policies and practices fail to hold officers accountable. In addition to providing analysis in the aggregate, the report also lists more than 100 individual officers who've been implicated in the most misconduct complaints, complaints of violence, and use of force incidents. So I want to be clear about this process. The data that BPD provided and that Code for America published was anonymous. However, I discovered that it is possible to cross-reference the data with other sources in order to personally identify the officers involved. Each line of data about a particular incident includes an identifying number for each individual officer, as well as personal characteristics and specific information about the incident. So for example, I could start with data about a specific officer-involved shooting, which statistically is a rarer incident than general misconduct. I then searched for news articles around the date of the shooting that identified the officers' names who were involved in a shooting on that date. I looked up their date of hire from Baltimore City employee data and approximate age and date of birth from publicly available sources to make sure that the identifying information matched what was listed in the databases. Then I isolated the same officers by identifying number in the use of force database, and where an arrest occurred after a use of force incident, I could search by the officer's name in Maryland Judiciary Case Search to confirm that I had identified the correct officer. I then confirmed an officer's involvement in multiple arrests over different years in order to verify a match. Arrest records on Judiciary Case Search also name other officers involved in the same arrest. So I could then link those officers' names back to their identifying numbers in the Project Comport databases and confirm their involvement in additional incidents as well. So over time, I was able to create a roster of BPD officers involved in the complaints, use of force incidents, and officer-involved shootings. I found officers who were implicated in numbers of complaints ranging from 0 to 227. Hundreds of officers had at least 10 complaints. Approximately 100 officers had 20 or more complaints. And I remind you that this data came from BPD itself. While the report does not accuse any officer of a criminal act, it is important for residents and policymakers to know who they are in order to help prevent future harm. However, we must do much more than intervene with problematic officers. We must transform the entire system as we reimagine how policing is done. So my hope is that this report will be a tool to better understand the scope of police violence and misconduct in Baltimore City and by extension, other police agencies in Maryland. I hope that it will help elevate the experiences of Black residents who have long known the threat that many of these officers represent. And by identifying these data points in areas where further research is needed, it will hopefully help others who are working to expose officer wrongdoing and win reforms that improve systems of police accountability. To that end, there are a few key recommendations that are clearly needed. We need to repeal entirely the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, especially because of how many officers are allowed to stay on the force after engaging in criminal and egregious misconduct. For example, Richard Pinero was caught fabricating evidence in 2017 and convicted of a misdemeanor, but because of the special rights for officers that the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights provides, he stayed on the force into 2020. We need to reform the Public Information Act to allow disclosure over all complaints of police misconduct to see how they were being investigated. For example, in 2019, Sherrod Watson committed perjury when testifying on the stand in a case and admitted that what he said was factually untrue. The Baltimore Sun filed a complaint against him, but BPD did not sustain the complaint. And while there's been a lot of work done around PIA reform in Annapolis, recent legislative proposals in the House and the Senate would only allow the disclosure of up to 7% of complaints during this time period. We also need a uniform statewide use of force standard. That standard should only allow the use of force when it is necessary as a last resort. Less than 10% of officers' force was used in self-defense or to make an arrest, which shows that officers predominantly use force when it is not necessary. BPD must develop a stronger early warning system based on best practices to intervene with problematic officers before they inflict more harm. And lastly, research has shown that officers may often become more likely to commit violence when they are partnered with other officers who have histories of violence themselves. For example, Ethan Newberg, who is facing charges stemming from a long pattern of harassment and intimidation, partnered often with a younger officer during this time period. That younger officer has been accumulating complaints at a faster rate. What is clear is that we cannot adequately address violence without addressing the extent to which police officers themselves contribute to that violence, particularly in Black communities. And it is important to know that even after the indictments of the officers who were involved in the gun trace task force scandal, current officers have been engaging in the same misconduct, collectively accumulating hundreds of complaints of false arrest, excessive force, planting evidence, and theft, while BPD appears to turn a blind eye. So we must create a better system that holds these officers accountable and reimagines how policing is done entirely. So again, we appreciate your interest in this work, and I'm certainly happy to take any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joe. We can now take questions in the chat. And there are direct links to the report itself in the chat and the press release that we will be sending out after this press event. Are there any questions? I know it's a lot to read. We can also be available for questions afterwards, after you've had a chance to digest all of the very powerful and important information that's included in the report today. All right, last call. Any questions? Otherwise, let me put my, the best way to reach me with press requests later today into the chat. Oh, we've got one. Hold on, let me put my email address in the chat here. The question, you've spoken about early intervention, so I was curious about the ACLU's opinion on BPD's EPIC program and whether it addresses these sorts of issues. Is that a program that you're familiar with?
I have some vague familiarity with it. I would certainly have to do more research into what exactly it entails. My understanding is that it did lead to some success in New Orleans and perhaps other cities, but we would have to take a closer look to determine our opinion on it.
Thank you.
Let's follow up with a written report.
Any other questions?
Meredith, may I say one thing to that question real quick?
Oh, sure, yes.
We do know that EPIC is like a peer intervention program that can help change the culture within the police department in a positive way. That is, we think, going to be one of the critical things. Joe mentioned earlier about how just the connection to certain officers who have a history of complaints and a history of misconduct can have a detrimental impact on other officers. And it's going to be critical that the police department, and we think that the police department is moving in the right direction on this with the consent decree and new leadership, but the police department has to be committed to implementing that in a way that has the outcome of making sure that officers feel safe to speak up and feel safe to hold each other accountable in a positive way. That is going to have a trickle-down effect throughout the city with regard to the relationship between the community and how we view our police department.
All right, thank you so much, Kaylin. All right, please contact me with any follow-up questions once you've had a chance to review the report and start to digest the information in there. We look forward to your questions. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.